So I was going to make a video like this about a year ago, back when I first played the game, but I didn't feel like replaying everything I played at that point, and then they announced a remake, and now we're here to not talk about that remake. Yeah, I figured that if I wanted to put out a 1000 Year Door video while people are still talking about the remake, I'd probably have to start before it comes out. So most of what I've edited and written will be about the GameCube version, but based on what footage has been released for the remake, I think that'll be mostly fine. I will talk about the remake near the end though, just in case there's anything worth noting in that version compared to the original. So, the 1000 Year Door. I mean, what else can I really say about it at this point? Pretty much since it came out, it's been held as the definitive Mario RPG, arguably even more so now that the series has kinda crashed and burned. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that it's one of the most beloved games in the entire Mario franchise, which is pretty impressive for a game nobody has played. Okay, I'm being a bit unfair. Obviously people have played it, you know, I played it, but the 1000 Year Door is infamous for going for just absurd prices on eBay. This is without the disc, by the way, and that makes it basically impossible for anyone who didn't play it at launch to play it now. So, you know, thank God we have this remake so that people can actually buy the game. But before the remake got announced, I was definitely one of the people who wasn't able to buy the game. I was born fairly late into the GameCube's life, just a few months after 1000 Year Door actually. And by the time I was getting into games, I'd hear people talking about this, look the game up on eBay, and then respond accordingly. I was thankfully able to play the games that came out directly before and after the 1000 Year Door, becoming pretty big fans of both. But by the time I was able to play the 1000 Year Door for myself, I wasn't as in much of a rush anymore. I knew I'd play it, I knew I'd enjoy it. I mean, it's a refinement of a gameplay formula I already like, and a community doesn't talk about a game for 20 years for no reason. So when I finally played the 1000 Year Door for myself, I was surprised to learn that it is actually so much better than everyone says it is. Like, I feel like we've started to take for granted just how good this game is in almost every aspect. I don't feel strongly enough about any of the Mario games to single out one as my favorite, but if I had to pick one, it would probably be the 1000 Year Door. So in a never before seen move, I'm going to talk about a game I like for a change, try to remind you how good this game actually is, and hopefully convince you that this game is worth your time. Let's get into it. The story starts, as most stories do, with Mario and Luigi getting a letter from the princess who tells them to meet her in a distant town known as Rogueport. And Mario, being the diligent little guy that he is, leaves to meet her immediately. Aha, just kidding. Peach had already been kidnapped by that point, because I guess she can't walk down the street for 5 seconds without someone wanting to put her in a bag. Though to be fair, she is the monarch of a distant nation, walking into the town square of Noosley and talking to mysterious cloaked figures on the side of the road, all without a bodyguard in sight. Though that might not actually be true, since the villains do admit they couldn't grab Peach immediately because a random old guy appeared before they could grab her. Meaning this is the first game in the series where Toadsworth indirectly saves the world. It was bound to happen at some point, buddy. Anyway, Mario arrives in Rogueport, walks down the street for 5 seconds, and oh, okay, I guess Peach isn't an idiot after all. Mario encounters the main villains of this game, the X-Nauts, who are harassing this friendly Goomba. So Mario, being the polite and considerate tourist that he is, immediately pounds them into the ground. After casually walking away from an angry mob, somehow completely unscathed, Mario and the Goomba, who is called Goombella, by the way, because I guess you could just slap a suffix onto any Mario enemy and call it a day. Anyway, Mario and Goombella are talking about why they're in Rogueport, and Mario tells her about the letter from Peach and how it came with this map. So Goombella says they should show it to a famous Goomba professor, and then there's talk of prophecy, legendary treasure, and then Mario has to go collect the 8 Chaos Emeralds to stop the bad man from doing the bad thing, tale as old as time. Yeah, the story wasn't really a highlight for me. I can appreciate it in some capacity. I like that it deliberately distances itself from the setting of most other Mario games, and it does have some genuinely great moments. A lot, actually. Chapters 3 and 4 were genuinely engaging, and a few of the partners were developed enough to the point where I was actually invested in their characters. But there are also some things that I consider to be straight up bad. To this day, I still don't understand why Bowser is in this game, and Peach's segments have her being, sexually harassed by a computer. So even though there are things to like about the story, the low points meant that it never got any better than your typical Mario game to me. Anyway, so about that combat. The Mario RPGs are generally well regarded among people who don't play a lot of traditional RPGs. You've already heard how the action commands make the turn-based combat system more accessible and engaging to people who haven't been able to get into other RPGs for one reason or another. And I feel like that puts me in a bit of a unique position because I am someone who likes those other RPGs. You know, stuff like Final Fantasy, SMT, Dragon Quest. Oh yeah, I've been getting really into Golden Sun recently. It's actually pretty good. So as someone who likes the RPGs that the Thousand Year Door breaks away from, I'm fully confident in saying that this combat system is great. Yeah, there's no surprise there. But it still surprises me how good this combat system is, both on its own merits and as an evolution of Paper Mario 64's similar system. At the very basic level, yeah, it's a pretty good combat system. But if you're willing to dig deeper and adjust your playstyle slightly, I do honestly think the Thousand Year Door stands as one of the best in its genre. But we'll get to that. Let's start with the basics first. So, action commands. When you hit the thing when Mario does the thing, so he does more thing. People have already given this combat system its due praise. It's easy to get to grips with, satisfying to learn, and the minigames are short enough to never become an annoyance. And I don't really have much else to add to that. It's a pretty great system all around. A small problem I have with it though, and this is only really a problem in 64, is that it still ends up being fairly uninteractive by the end of the game. Because once you hit the button, hooray, the rest of the attack just happens without you. It's not that big of a problem, and I'm probably only complaining about this because I played through the whole game in a week, but it did start to grind on me a little by the time I was reaching chapter 7. So how does the Thousand Year Door fix this? Because on the surface it looks basically the same as 64, but there are two major differences. First of all, your partners have a slightly wider variety of inputs now, a lot of which aren't shared with Mario, which, you know, is nice. But the big one is the addition of stylish moves. If you press the A button at the right time during an attack, either Mario or his partner will do a special animation in the middle of their attack. And it's such a minor thing, it's literally just a few extra button presses thrown into your turn. But the way it impacts how the game both looks and plays is insane. Like, look at the full animation for Power Smash. This never gets tiring to do, and you're incentivized to do this as well. Stylish moves are used to impress the audience, which actually that's another really neat thing about the Thousand Year Door. The audience can throw you items, throw rocks at you, drop lights on you, give enemies buffs, put each other to sleep, scare each other off. They're even a factor in some boss fights, which is cool. Didn't know where else to mention all of that, but the most important thing the audience does is boost your star power. When you do an attack in battle, your star power goes up, and doing stylish moves makes it go up even more. You can also appeal to the crowd, which works similarly to focus in the first game, but since that uses a turn, it's almost always better to just do stylish moves instead. Mastering stylish moves means you can attack while charging your star power, which you can use for boosting your attack further, healing, or doing massive damage to the enemy's side. So not only are they satisfying to do, they also affect gameplay in such a way that getting the timing down for them means you'll be in a better position for basically every fight. Though this does expose the closest thing to a problem I have with Thousand Year Door's battles compared to 64, and that's the balance. In Thousand Year Door, by just doing stylish moves, with the right badges equipped of course, you can charge your star power by 1 point in a single turn. Whereas in 64, without using focus, that takes around 4 turns. This ends up trivializing a lot of encounters in the Thousand Year Door if you're even slightly good at the game, since you can heal or do massive damage almost whenever you want to. Whereas in 64, I found I had to be a lot more careful in standard encounters, since just healing 5 HP could take most of a battle to be able to do again. And I think because of that, 64 is arguably a better balanced game than the Thousand Year Door. But even in spite of that, I still think the Thousand Year Door is a better overall game, in part because of how unbalanced it is. I'm a big fan of games that you can completely break if you know what you're doing, and the Thousand Year Door arguably requires the most skill to get that to happen out of any game on that list. And that brings me to one of my favorite parts about both of these games, the badges, which basically serve as your equipment. Throughout the game, you'll find them either hidden in the environment, being held by enemies, or being sold in shops. Each badge takes up a certain amount of BP slots when equipped, which you can increase by leveling up. And these badges have a variety of different effects. From increasing your stats, to giving you new hammer and jump attacks, to increasing the power of your hammer and jump but making it so you can only hammer or only jump, revealing enemy health, nullifying status effects, decreasing FP cost, increasing FP gain, letting you attack certain types of enemies with attacks they're normally immune to, and of course, making your hammer play silly sounds. Which, by the way, is a legitimate strategy for the first boss. somehow. What's great about badges is that they give the player a lot of versatility with how they want to play the game. To start off with, things are pretty similar for everyone, but a few chapters in, once players have had the chance to get a wider variety of badges, they can equip them however they want. You can have a balanced set of hammer and jump attacks prepped for any situation, or you can go all in on jumps and end up doing 10 damage per turn, which, considering how low health bars are for almost everyone in the game, is pretty overpowered. But believe it or not, this isn't even close to being the peak of the game's combat. No, we can go much further than this. So, gonna throw up a spoiler warning real quick. I don't know how much it matters, but I am about to show a late game boss fight, so here's a timestamp if you want to avoid that for now. Anyway, everyone who's staying, this is Gloomtail. Be sure to say hi to him because we're not going to be seeing him for much longer. Now, the most obvious way to become overpowered in this game is to increase your attack power, and the easiest way to do that is to equip the badges that explicitly increase your attack power. Provided you haven't been farming for them, this gives you an attack boost of 2, which combined with the jump and hammer upgrade you get throughout the game, lets you do 10 damage per turn like I mentioned earlier. But there are other badges that increase your attack power with various trade-offs, and the one that's going to be the most influential for this build is the Mega Rush badge, which gives Mario an attack boost of 5 when he's on 1 HP. And while this does put us in an obviously risky position, if our goal is to boost our attack power as much as possible, we need to have this badge equipped. And once we do, that'll affect how we equip the rest of our badges. For example, we can unequip any badges that increase our max HP, since having a cap of 40 doesn't really matter when we're going to be stuck at 1 anyway. And we can unequip any badges that decrease the amount of damage we take, since any boss by this point is going to deal at least 1 HP. And this frees up our BP to equip other badges that can increase our attack power, like P up D down since defense doesn't really matter anymore, All or Nothing since I don't plan on failing action commands anyway, Jumpman since it lets me do slightly more damage than using the hammer, Pretty Lucky since it lets this happen, and Peekaboo since actually knowing how much damage I'm dealing to the enemy is kinda the point of this whole segment. And Power Rush, even though I don't think it does anything while I'm at 1 HP. Once we're actually in the fight, we can use Power Lift to increase our attack even more, use an item to make sure Mario doesn't get hit, and perfect the timing of Spring Jump to do 36 damage per turn. And while that's sinking in, let me just remind you, that's just under a quarter of the final boss's max HP. Now I did use save states for this example, just for the sake of optimizing my turns and also getting the timing right for Spring Jump. You could definitely do this without save states if you were any more patient than me, but I think regardless of how you do it, the fact you can do it is a perfect showcase for the potential of this combat system. And this may not even be the peak of the combat either. I had a lot of BP I didn't use in this fight, and some of the jump badges I didn't use may have done more damage than Spring Jump. If you somehow got any more of these badges and found a better jump badge, you could probably go past 40 damage per turn. And I haven't even mentioned first strikes, items, the better special moves, the fact partners have health bars now, the fact they have more abilities that are actually useful, like Goombella. The token party member you replace immediately gets an ability that gives Mario an extra turn. If I knew about that earlier, I would have actually used it more than the one time that I did. I think my point has been made. There's a lot to like about the combat, even if you aren't willing to optimize your equipment to this extent. And if I keep talking about it, I'm just gonna end up repeating myself, so let's move on to talking about something I'm a little more mixed on. So inside of Battles, it plays like a spicier turn-based RPG, as you just heard me talk about for way too long. But outside of Battles, it plays closer to a 3D platformer than an RPG. And I think the footage speaks for itself for the most part. There's not a whole lot you can say about jumping in a Mario game. And I don't think it's fair to compare this to other 3D platformers, since the focus of this game is still very much on the battles. And these areas mainly serve to pace out the battles with platforming challenges and puzzles. But it's the way that these areas are designed that I find the most interesting, since it does, in a way, give each chapter a distinct feel outside of their individual settings or plot lines. Chapter 1, for example, has the final area of the chapter visible right from the start, but it's blocked by an item that you need to get at the end of a pretty straight shot. So you go along the path before you, experiencing the story of the chapter until you get your next party member, at which point the path you just walked down is recontextualized as a tutorial for his abilities, which I think is pretty neat. And these scenarios are even revisited and built upon in the castle. Chapter 5, meanwhile, is designed designed to be one giant circle. You start on this beach area, go through the jungle and more intense puzzles and platforming of the cave before ending up back on the beach. Chapter 3 is interesting just because it pretty much takes place across 3 rooms. You have the waiting room where you enter a fight, the hallway leading into the arena, and the arena itself. There are areas outside of these that are important for the story of the chapter, but for the most part you'll only be in these 3 rooms. Or I guess 5 rooms since there's like 3 waiting rooms. I don't know, I thought it was cool. But the one that I think people find the most memorable is chapter 6. There are only about 5 rooms in this chapter, but it stops them from getting stale by having a pretty unique quest line, interesting character interactions, a day and night cycle of sorts, and an extended period off the train in an area that I honestly wish was expanded upon. I may not think the gameplay is that good for the most part, but it does help this stand out as the most unique chapter in the game. But while these 4 chapters are good in their own way, there are others that I think aren't as good. Chapter 8 isn't here because it's pretty much a straight shot to the end with some puzzles. It's not really worth talking about. Chapter 2 is designed similarly to Chapter 1, with the end being visible from the start, but there's more backtracking on the straight shot that gets kinda tedious, and the last half itself is kinda difficult to navigate. Though that may be because I'm an idiot. The punies were pretty fun to play with though. They could be kind of annoying at times, but they aren't nearly as bad as you'd probably expect. Chapter 4 is fine to start with, since it's another straight shot up until the boss. But because of how this chapter is structured, you're forced to run through it about 5 times in total. And then there's Chapter 7. I don't like Chapter 7. It starts off on a painfully bad foot by forcing you to look for a character that you saw at the start of the game, which sets you on a questline of talking to people in places that aren't really explained to you to start with. And solely for my own amusement, I've already shown the locations of these characters throughout this segment. I won't tell you when though. It also ends with him being in the same place you started, which is just kinda mean. The last half of this chapter isn't great either, since it's a bunch of grey hallways connected by slow moving elevators. Yeah, not really a great note to end the game on. But I can kind of forgive these chapters for being mediocre in some ways, since for the most part, you're not really meant to return to them once you're done. At least not as far as the main story is concerned. So even though running up and down chapter 4 is a drag, you only need to do it once. And if the reason they're designed like this is because they wanted to put more time into the areas you do return to, I definitely think that was the right decision. The rogue port areas are great. In fact, they're the reason I wanted to make a video on this game in the first place. The town itself is pretty good. There are a handful of neat things you can see as you unlock new abilities and progress through the game, but even that can't hold a candle to the genius that is the rogue port sewers. The way new areas open up after almost every chapter makes it exciting to go down there to see what you can find, because you know there is almost always something new to find. And even disregarding the optional content, the way exploring it becomes more efficient during the main story it's mind-boggling. There's no other word for it. During the prologue, the trip down to the Thousand-Year Door has you jumping across these platforms, walking past these enemies, turning into a plane and flying down to the room with the door. But once you finish chapter 1, you can use paper mode to completely skip the platforming and enemies. And since you end chapter 2 in this room as well, you don't have to deal with them there either. And chapter 3 gives you the first hammer upgrade so you can skip the plane. Chapter 3 lets you into the west side of the sewers as well. Chapter 4's tube mode lets you move between the east and west sides without needing to go through the town. And Bobbery removes the need to use tube mode altogether. Every time you go down to the sewers, the process of going down to the sewers becomes more efficient. Seeing all of this happen in real time was insane to me, and I'm surprised I haven't seen more people talking about it before. And knowing I would be able to spend a good hour or so just exploring the sewers made finishing a chapter feel rewarding every time. And like, I know I said there wasn't much to say about the story, but there is one thing I think is worth highlighting. I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of talk of prophecy and an ancient civilization that fell to ruin because of the awakened evil, and in a lot of games I'd find this sort of thing really tedious, but I'm more fine with it here because you actually get to explore the ruins for yourself. It's not exactly obvious about it, but to be honest, I think I prefer that. Though something I am a little less positive about is the optional content. I'm not really sure if this would fall under world structure, but I don't really know where else to mention it. I mean, we could give it its own segment, I guess. But the optional content itself isn't bad necessarily. I just think a majority of it isn't really worth doing unless you're really committed to getting 100%. And since it's difficult to tell what's worth doing immediately, think of this as a PSA for new players, as well as a review of the optional content of the Thousand-Year Door. Probably the closest the game gets to having traditional side quests is the Trouble Center in the east area of Rogueport. Here you can accept troubles from various NPCs, and after completing them they'll give you a reward. which is usually just coins. Most of them are fetch quests as well, and a lot of them don't really do much to flesh out the world. So I don't really think they're worth your time no matter how you look at them. Though one neat thing about the Trouble Center is how it helps direct you to the rest of the optional content. Like you accept a trouble and, oh, I can redo the Glitz Pit, oh, I can play at the casino, oh, the Pit of 100 Trials exists. But even with that in mind, only a handful of them are worth doing. The one I think everyone should do is the quest to unlock Miss Mouse, since getting her lets you steal badges from enemies. Zest T's trouble lets you cook 2 items instead of 1, which is highly situational, but I still think it's worth doing. And while I don't think the casino is as useful as Miss Mouse or Zest T, you can get some pretty good badges there and the minigames are pretty fun, so I think it's worth doing the troubles to unlock them just to check them out. Everything else is kinda just a tedious grind, and if you really need coins that badly, there's a much easier way to get a lot more than by doing troubles. Now I don't have any footage of this since I forgot about it during my playthrough, but in the Rogueport Harbour around here, you'll find this green mouse called Lumpy. He'll appear in chapters 2, 3, and 4, and he'll ask Mario for 100 coins in each. He'll disappear in chapter 5, but he'll triple the coins you gave him when he reappears in chapter 6. I think it's kinda dumb that he appears in the harbour, since you don't need to go back there until you've already missed your chance to talk to him. But I mean, if you know about it already, I guess it's not as bad. You can also redo the Glitz Pit after finishing chapter 3, but since it doesn't change from chapter 3, the only reason to do it is to get coins. Which, like, just go talk to Lumpy. At least Rawkhawk gives you the chance to test out new badge setups on someone with decently high HP, since you can refight him whenever you want once you get to rank 1. But the most interesting optional thing, and the thing I think most people should at least try to do, is the Pit of 100 Trials. It's a sequence of 100 fights, well, 91 fights, that can't easily be opted out of, and it's probably the most challenging this game gets. By the end of the one run I did, I barely had enough HP to make it to the end, even when I was using Sweet Feast. It's a commitment I don't think everyone will have the patience needed to reach the end, especially when you die on floor 98 3 hours in, keeping in mind that a game over forces you to reload your previous save, with no save blocks in the pit itself. But I do recommend everyone at least tries to do a part of it, since the items you can get there are pretty useful. Okay, what else? Oh yeah, if you want to get all the badges, you'll need to talk to this guy in Rogueport. He updates his stock every time you leave Rogueport, so you can use that to make sure he has the badges you want. Also, entering the Rogueport sewers counts as leaving Rogueport. At least it does in the original. I don't know if they'll change that for the remake. Okay, I think that's everything. I could keep talking about the things I like about this game for a very long time. In fact, there's a lot of minor stuff I didn't even mention. Stuff like Luigi's subplot, which parodies Thousand Year Door in a lot of ways, how good the soundtrack is, how a lot of the jokes are actually surprisingly funny, and even some of the minor points about the presentation, like how many of these transition effects there are without any of them repeating. Like, I'm willing to bet it happens at least once, but I swear they're all unique, it's crazy. But I think there are only so many ways I can uncontroversially say that a good game is good before you start to get the idea a little too much. And even though I only played it for the first time a year ago, the fact that I enjoyed it as much as I did is a testament to how timeless this game is. It really does feel like the sort of game I'm going to be thinking about for the next 20 years. And last year, I remember lamenting the fact this game never got more of a chance. So when they finally announced the remake, I was just as excited as everyone else. Not only so I could play it portably, but also because it meant the game would get the second chance it deserves, on a platform that people actually own without them needing to spend $175 to not even get the disc. Hey Future Sam, what do you think of this eBay listing? Yep, it's still dumb. I realize we're not exactly winning in the realm of transitions, but we're gonna talk about the remake now. You know, it's really weird spending the last month looking at footage that looks like this, only to eventually play the remake over on my Twitch channel and find myself absolutely speechless. Oh, how far we've come. Now, I've only played until the end of chapter 4 so I can enjoy the rest of the game in my own time, but from what I've played so far, this remake is exactly what I expected. It is the Thousand Year Door, now with a new coat of paint and enough quality of life changes to almost render the original obsolete, at least for me. Very few changes have been made to the things that worked about the original. The combat is still as good as ever without many noticeable changes. The only things that really stood out to me were that Earth Tremor feels significantly easier than before. Tattles can now be viewed mid-battle once the enemy has been added to your tattle log, and the guard animation still plays when you fail to guard. So mistiming inputs feels a little more fair now, which fixes a problem I didn't even think about when playing the original, which is a recurring theme for a lot of the changes that are worth discussing. Everything outside of battles arguably warranted the most change, and thankfully they've managed to remedy most of the issues in a way that doesn't feel unnatural. For starters, you can now hold the L button to change partners without needing to go into the menus, and any emails sent to Mario that don't directly impact the story now appear as a pop-up rather than interrupting gameplay. And again, it never crossed my mind how much of a pace breaker these things were in the original, but now that they've been tweaked, everything flows so much better now. And speaking of flowing better, they've mostly fixed the backtracking problems. Previously, only chapters 1, 2, 5, and 6 had warp pipes in the sewers that were split across 2 rooms, which is one of the contributing factors to chapter 7 being as bad as it is. But now every chapter has a warp pipe and they're all in the same room, which you can quickly get to from the main area of Rogueport. And since the pipe is in the same area as the badge shop I mentioned earlier, needing to leave Rogueport to make him restock is basically a non-issue. And while there haven't been many dramatic changes to the chapters themselves, there was one change made to chapter 4 which almost cuts the backtracking in half. Some changes have been made to 100% as well. Star pieces and shine sprites are a little easier to find now that the map tells you if you've cleared out an area. A new badge has been added as well, but based on its description and the requirements to get it, I think it'll only be an enticing reward to just me. The Trouble Center now lets you pay for hints if you get lost, which is nice, and completing Jolene's trouble will unlock a new boss in the Glitz Pit, so there's actually more of a reason to replay it now. And speaking of secret bosses, a new boss has been added to the Pit of 100 Trials after you beat it for the first time. I'm not going to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, but once I learned what it was, it felt weirdly fitting. And while all of these are good changes that vastly improve how you play the game, inside the main story and out, there are a handful of things about this remake that many would consider to be deal breakers. Arguably the most controversial change is the rewritten dialogue, which I have opinions about. On the one hand, the reformatted and entirely new tutorials are nice to have, and there's even a hint system for when players get lost now. But if you've been online in the last couple of weeks, you'll know that these aren't what people are talking about. I'm going to keep this brief since it doesn't really relate to the topic at hand, and because it warrants a discussion on its own. Vivian being trans is such a minor thing that the people who appreciate the representation will like its inclusion, and the people who don't need to learn to get over themselves. It's one text box in a children's game, it's not representative of the collapse of society. I do have more thoughts on this topic, but I think it's best we move on. But the changes that are arguably the most impactful for this version are the visuals and performance. I think it probably goes without saying that this game looks phenomenal. The lighting, the character models, the slight imperfections to the environment that really help sell the paper aesthetic. This honestly stands as one of my favorite looking games on the Switch. However, it's not without its problems. Some rooms definitely feel overly bright, sometimes the room is lit by a light source that realistically shouldn't exist, and some rooms go a little too crazy with the reflection effects. And while this doesn't always look bad, it does often lose something compared to the original. With its flatter and often darker lighting, it generally feels more consistent and less like it's trying to impress you with how realistically it can light a room. But usually whenever there's a room that feels like it loses its original character, there are at least 2 areas that look stunning enough to make up for it, or at least do a good job at emulating the original character. And even when that doesn't happen, areas usually have enough minor details to make up for it. I can't single out every example I noticed, but I think the most important differences are visible in the cutscenes. What were once fairly static scenes that mostly just zoom the camera in have been subtly reframed to be generally more interesting to look at. And even when the camera does stay in place, the more expressive animations from almost the entire cast do a lot to make even the most minor of conversations enjoyable to watch. All of these changes do come with a trade-off though. While the original game ran at a smooth 60 frames per second, the Switch version only runs at 30 frames per second. Which is a shame, but whether or not it breaks the game is largely dependent on how you feel about it. The Switch version undeniably looks less smooth, but after a few minutes of playing I stopped noticing it as much. Even during combat, I never felt like I was unable to hit certain moves because of the frame rate. And whenever it did feel sluggish, it felt like it was caused more by animation times than anything else. I think this problem may may seem worse than it is on videos like this, since switching from one to the other doesn't paint the Switch version in the best light. But I think on its own, the Switch version running at 30 frames per second isn't really that bad. So overall, I'm very happy with how this remake turned out. If they had just ported the original to Switch in widescreen, I would have been satisfied with playing it portably. But with the new visual flair and all the quality of life changes, it's taken what I'd consider to be a great game and has made it a contender for an all-time favorite. I cannot recommend it enough. It absolutely deserves your attention. Give it a chance, try it for yourself, and you will understand why this game is as praised as it is. So I actually kind of hate plugging anything of mine, since I think we can all agree it can feel super invasive. But it is apparently surprisingly effective, so I want to see if doing it here does anything. Obviously the best way to help smaller channels is to subscribe to them, and if you already have, thank you. This video took a lot out of me, especially towards the end, and I still ended up putting it out late in spite of that. So any form of support is very much appreciated. I think I've accepted that I can't put out videos like this as regularly as I'd like to, so if you're interested to see whenever I actually upload again, please make sure to subscribe if you haven't. And if you're interested to see what I'm doing in these 3-month-long voids, I mentioned earlier I have a Twitch channel that I am decently active on. I stream a variety of games from Metal Gear to Rhythm Heaven to Cuphead, honestly just whatever I find interesting. And I'll probably end up attempting that new boss in the Pit of 100 Trials once I get to it, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, come check it out sometime. Anyway, now that the shameless plug is over, I'm gonna go crash for the rest of the week. Take care of yourselves, have fun, and please buy this game. It's really good.